KC, so let's talk a little bit about where CCUS can potentially find a place in the oil and gas value chain, right? I mean, Chevron has experience in deploying it at LNG, the Gorgon facility in Australia. We know that a lot of it is obviously, I mean, most of it is today being practiced for EOR. But what about refining, midstream? Where else do you see opportunities? I mean, I know you guys are, I think, piloting one of the carbon capture technologies in the Bakersfield asset in California. So maybe talk a little bit about where you see the best opportunities for CCUS in the oil and gas value chain.
Sure, I think you've got to look at it more holistically. So we were part of Quest as well with Shell, and so we've got some experience in Canada too. But just thinking about it through the upstream, we still have work to do to decarbonize our assets there, and that has to do with not just the gas coming out of the ground, but also the electricity that's generated through the turbines, and that's usually gas-fired. And so working on how we reduce or create capture technology that can handle those low concentrations, high volumes that come off of those turbines. Those are like frame 7, frame 9s, and so they're quite large, and there's some pretty high volume there. So that's in the upstream. That goes somewhat into our cogen in an area like San Joaquin Valley. And then you start to look at the pipelines. And so back to having every arrow in the quiver or every club in the bag, you look at a gas pipeline that has access to electricity easily, they're going to electrify. It makes sense. If they don't, and they can put a capture technology onto the pipeline itself, then they're probably going to look at that. But we don't have the economics for that today. And that's why we're invested in these novel technologies, because we see them getting down to 100 to 300 tons per day with the carbon clean unit, the Cyclone CC unit, concentrations with some concentration technology or membrane technology on top, starting to get under the 10 or into the single digits and continuing to progress. And then you can start to look at areas like if you wanted to maybe over time reduce your capital on what is now conventional technology, an amine tower. You could look at Svante's metal organic framework, which starts to capture at about 800 tons per day, moving up to 1,500 with one of their larger units is their aspiration. We're not there yet. That's the whole point. Is my job is to try to get us there faster. I think there's a whole market to open up in that area. We look at companies like GE, who we've had a long-standing partnership with, to say, you know, what can we do to close the gap? And so I think a lot of it has to do with just over time progressing the technology as soon as we can, looking at our portfolio and understanding that there are SMRs in the refinery, there are FCCs in the refinery that we can definitely go after with these technologies more economically in a couple of years. The thing about a refinery to me is it's a little different than, let's say, a cement kiln, where you get 2/3 to 3/4 of the emissions coming out of one source, give or take. If you look at a refinery, you've got maybe the cat cracker, maybe the SMR, and those are pretty big. Then you move into some heaters and other things. And so it ends up being, again, a portfolio of solutions that could include electrification. It could include pre-combustion with hydrogen. You know, you talk quickly about modular reactors and novel technology in the nuclear space. I think those are all opportunities that we need to be looking at to solve for the problem of just ongoing carbon emissions.
And is your focus and portfolio primarily focused on carbon capture? So once the carbon's made, how do I capture it? Or does it also include some of the things like where can we do PPAs and where can we install a small modular reactor so that we don't produce carbon if we can?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Chevron is looking at the next couple of years to decarbonize not only itself and its assets, but also about 1.5 years ago, it stood up Chevron New Energies. New Energies has the carbon capture organization in it with utilization and storage. And then we also have a hydrogen organization and a novel technologies and offsets. So emerging and offsets is what we call it. And that's looking at different emerging power solutions as well as offsets for that last mile that's really hard to get economically. And so the structure itself in my organization is carbon capture and utilization technology, not necessarily on the storage side. I think we've got another department for that area, but looking at all the different ways that we can manage the carbon above ground.
So Casey, maybe let's go down the value chain here for you. Utilization, I guess, what's interesting there? What's Chevron working on there?
Yeah, so taking it back up the value chain for a second, you've got your hubs and they definitely have opportunity. There was a map shown that showed some of the organic plays geologically and geographically that marry together well. So that's great. We luckily have a lot of emissions in those places, so that helps as well. But there's about, I think it was 60% of the emissions were stranded. Smaller plays, but of the overall CO2 emissions globally, 60% of them are stranded. And it means that the pipelines aren't going to be economic to bring them to bear to a storage facility. So I go back to, I have a 6-year-old, so reduce, reuse, recycle is really big in our house right now. And he thinks it's great that we can, reuse carbon first, and then we can maybe store it if we need to, or find other marketable demand sinks for it. So the circular economy is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I think it's important for us to be looking at alternatives to just storage, and that's what Chevron's doing. So the two areas that we're looking at, again, it goes back to tech ventures, getting in early, and then us starting to understand exactly how marketable those are and scalable are in the mineralization area, and then a little bit in the polymers, but really more so headed over to CO2 to fuels, which obviously makes a lot of sense for our business. And we get some potential customers and partners that say, no, we don't want the fuels. We really just want to turn it into some sort of inert material, either as a feedstock or that we can just put in the ground and leave it there as is. So there's a lot of different, I think, decision-making sector by sector that we want to make sure that we can play across the market. And so we're looking at what solutions suit Chevron, but also what solutions may suit other hard-to-abate sectors like the cement industry or the steel industry or the power industry.
Okay, but so there, what is the dynamic? So this is CO2 that Chevron is capturing, that you are looking at technologies to use to convert it into something, and then so you're looking for a customer to go and sell that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've got, within our own refineries, El Segundo, it's going to be tough to get CO2 out and into some sort of storage play. So El Segundo, do we look at a CO2 to fuels play on site or nearby? But then again, there may be a cement kiln or some sort of factory nearby that we may want to partner with and then
mineralize,
say, let's do that together and mineralize, and you can use it for concrete feedstock, right? So as an aggregate. So it's really just about understanding what are these new markets that we want to enter into and partner with those other hard-to-abate sectors to solve for the bigger problem and make sure it's sustainable.
Okay, and why is it hard to get to capture CO2 out of El Segundo?
It's about the value chain. So it's not hard to capture it. It's about how do you move it out to a place where we can actually store it efficiently and economically.
Okay. So it's just maybe the location and what's nearby, and maybe there's no CO2 pipeline. It's probably impossible to get something permitted in California, things like that are...
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, that's helpful.
You answered my question for me.
No, I'm trying to understand. There's a lot of jokes internally that you tell Uday something, then he'll say, "Okay, let me replay this to you," and then he'll tell you the same thing that you told him, and then it makes a lot more sense to him.
It all works out.
Yeah.
To tag onto that a little bit, I mean, what I've seen recently in the last couple of months is a lot of our projects are kind of moving with the pipelines, obviously. But so there's the classics. Well, it's all about what you do with the CO2, right? If it's permanent sequestration, you're looking at all the permits, and when those permits go, then the pipelines go, then all the projects go. And what we're seeing those, on this giant pipeline, they're kind of segmented towards the pipeline. If the pipeline gets delayed 2 years, all of those projects get delayed 2 years with it. And so, I mean, it's common sense, but it's something that's becoming very obvious at where they're putting the CO2.
So the compressors that you guys are building, are they mainly for injection and storage sites, or I guess where in the
Everyone talks about capture and transportation. We're in between. So coming off a capture unit,
okay, I understand.
There's an export compressor, and it's really funny. I was at the DOE project update, all the technology, and everyone talks about how cool their mousetrap is. And at the bottom of every single one, there's an export compressor, and people are like, we'll just buy that. I'm like, no, you won't. It's a very underrated thing because CO2 compression is very complex in comparison to hydrocarbons or air. Like it's very compressible, and so the same mass flow that'll go through an impeller almost the size of this chart behind us also will go through an impeller like this big at 200 bar pressures, and so it's a very interesting dynamic. And you're talking about different stuff than what you typically have in your mind as compression.
So who do you consider as your primary competitor, and why do people come to MAN versus them?
Sure. Yeah. We've got the longest track record, as I mentioned, and so people like that, and we have kind of unique R&D test stand capabilities in Berlin. So all of our CO2 machines come from Berlin, and then we partner with different people depending on local content requirements, things like that. So we technically de-risk these projects quite a bit in comparison to our competitors. Big competitors are obviously Siemens, MHI. Those are probably the only real two. I mean, Copco's there too, but not really at the same pressure levels. So, I mean, that's from my perspective. Maybe I don't know everything, but if you add up all the manufacturing capacity across all those guys, you still need way more CO2 compression. So it's kind of it's a real supply chain issue that people are just starting to wake up to.
And what happens to some of that manufacturing capacity, especially with IRA and now the EU Green Deal talking about localizing a lot of that manufacturing capacity, or at least the incentives being tied to manufacturing capacity?
Yeah, so we're a giant German company, right? The core machines are going to come from Europe always, but then the question becomes, so another interesting thing about CO2 compression is all of the coolers and piping and pipe runs become very critical to the performance of that machine. And so when we sell a package, get flange to flange, you have to source all of that, and that becomes MAN's scope, right? And so, back to your question on local content, we can partner with people kind of in any region. There's a lot of people that make exchangers. They're quite special, actually, but we can get around that piece, having the core machine always come from Europe, basically.
Okay. That's interesting, and I think some of this is still to play out and all of that stuff.
Sure.
Yeah.